So the Taliban have captured part of Afghanistan, and now people are wondering, is this true Islam? Does the Taliban represent Islam? Or is it unfair to say that the Taliban are Islamic? I'm Abdullah Samir. I'm your friendly ex-Muslim. Today, I'm going to tell you about the Taliban and about whether or not they are Islamic. Is the Taliban following the best, most correct version of Islam? Well, every version of Islam is based on a human interpretation. A human interpretation, a human effort of trying to understand the holy books, the so-called revelation from Allah, and the teachings of Muhammad. But every step along that process has a human effort. In the very beginning, you have the Quran, which was preserved by human beings. There are multiple variant readings of the Quran, and sometimes these variant readings lead to different outcomes. For example, there's a verse in the Quran where Shias and Sunnis differ on whether or not you have to wipe while doing wudu, the washing of before the prayer. The other difference you find is that when it comes to hadith, the Sunni hadith, it's again a human process of collection and preservation. Which hadith are actually true? Which hadith are not? Well, that's a human best guess effort. So scholars will try to figure out which are correct, which are not. Okay, let's say now we've agreed upon which hadith are correct. Muhammad actually did so-and-so thing. Now what? Well, now you have to figure out which hadith cancels which other hadith. This is called Usool al-fiqh. So basically, how the fiqh, how the rulings are interpreted, that is all, again, a human effort. And the rules for interpreting this are a human effort. Can the hadith cancel the Quran? Or does the Quran always go over the hadith? Well, most Sunnis would say the hadith is an explanation or an interpretation that Muhammad did, or Muhammad's actions are actually proof, even if the Quran doesn't say something. So most Sunnis would never say the Quran cancels hadith. But that's a question. The other question is, well, what about the timing of so-and-so hadith? So there's hadith that came before and after. There are examples even in the Quran of verses that come before and after. And does one verse abrogate another verse? That's hotly contested as well. And then after all this, you now have to figure out, well, was this a universal ruling or was this only for Muhammad's time? Muhammad said, don't let the pants go below the ankles. Right? Don't let your izar, your garment, hang below the ankles because it's in the hellfire. So to this day, you have Salafi Muslims that wear their pants up above the ankles. They take it literally and they think it applies even today. Whereas some other Muslims will say, well, Abu Bakr, the caliph of Islam after Muhammad, he asked Muhammad and he said, I don't wear it out of pride, so is that okay? And Muhammad said, that's fine. But if you didn't know about that hadith, then maybe you would consider to this day, or maybe if you think that hadith is invalid or whatever. So you have so many differences already. As you can see, just from this few minutes I've been explaining, you will understand why there's so many sects in Islam, why there's so many different interpretations, why new Muslims often, or newly practicing Muslims often struggle to understand, how do I follow Islam? Should I follow a madhab, not follow a madhab? Even when it comes to Allah's names and attributes, like his hands and his face and his shin, can I take that literally? Or is that simply a metaphor? Or, it means something else. Does Allah's hands mean his power? When Allah comes down every night, what does that mean? Right? Is he literally coming down every night to the lowest heaven? That's what the hadith says. And that's an argument between Salafis and Asharis. Now you have a bit of an idea as to how complicated it is to interpret Islam. Right? This is something that people do for a living. So now you can understand that how can there be a true Islam? Who is to know what really happened? Did Muhammad really appoint Ali? Or was it actually the case that Abu Bakr should have been the first caliph, right? So are Shias right or Sunnis right? And Shias have their own hadith, right? So obviously, when you look at the Quran, you will incline towards a certain position, the Quran and especially the hadith. You will incline to a certain position. For example, well, if Shi'ism is true, then why are the 12 Imams not mentioned in the Quran? Right? That's a good question, right? Shias will work around this by saying, well, that it's mentioned in different ways, right? Like the 12 tribes or something like that, right? Ismailis, I was born as an Ismaili before I converted to Sunni Islam. They say a lot of the things in the Quran, you have to look at the inner meaning, not the outward meaning, right? So they get out of it that way. The point is, the jihadists, the Taliban, the ISIS, their version of Islam is based on many assumptions. Assumption that you have to not just take the hadith as true, but also that the hadith are universal and should be applied even today. Some scholars, for example, Mufti Abu Layth, would say that slavery is banned in Islam now because Muhammad was trying to eliminate it using trajectory hermeneutics. So he was trying to limit the options for slavery and limit the ways that people could become slaves. I don't buy this, personally. I don't buy that the apostasy law was actually a treason law. I don't buy any of that. But some Muslim scholars are saying this. Some Muslim scholars are saying that actually the hadith about Aisha being 6 when she was married and 9 when it was consummated, those are not valid. Those are not correct hadith, even though it was narrated by her herself. Because there's a weakness in the chain, and all of them go through, Urwa or whatever it is. There's like one companion that narrated all these, and they want to question his legitimacy. So, in reality, from my perspective, this hadith is being challenged because of inconvenience, right? But there are scholars that say that Aisha was actually 18. So, regardless of whatever the actual historical Muhammad was and what he did, we'll probably never know that. We're going based on a mythology, and the mythology can be interpreted 100 different ways. For sure, someone can't say, I worship Jesus and I'm Muslim. That would be like obviously a contradiction. So there's not an infinite number of interpretations. There are obviously viable interpretations and interpretations which are not viable, right? So when it comes to ISIS and all of these extremist groups, are they viable interpretations of Islam? Actually, I think they are, because the hadith are easy to interpret in a very violent way. The Quran itself, if you read Surah Tawbah, Surah 9, has a lot of antagonism and hatred, and the Quran itself from beginning to end is quite antagonistic towards non-Muslims, uses words like deaf, dumb, and blind and stuff like that. So if you wanted to be joining one of these, if you wanted to fight for an Islamic state, it would be pretty easy, which is why you have people like George Georgalis, who converted to Islam from Texas, and he became one of the top members of ISIS, and he's debating people in Arabic as to the merits of ISIS, right? So ISIS, obviously, they do some things that even, nobody else would do in Islam. The vast majority do not accept ISIS for whatever reason. And now with the Taliban are basically Deobandi. Even the Indian Deobandi scholars are saying, oh, Taliban has nothing to do with our Deobandi, traditions. They're saying that. And of course, they're going to say that, don't blame us for extremism, which is true. Don't blame them for extremism, but you can blame Islam for extremism because Islam has a lot of violent, terrible things in it. So the Muslims that say, these groups have nothing to do with Islam are being unfair. The groups that say ISIS is a true Islam are being unfair too. ISIS is just one manifestation of Islam, just one possible interpretation. And yes, there is some strength behind that particular interpretation, but it's not the only opinion or the only interpretation, and it's not the only valid interpretation of Islam. At the end of the day, you're arguing over mythology and you're arguing over a man-made religion. There's not going to be one right and wrong way of interpreting it. There's going to be contradictions. There's so many contradictions from beginning to end in Islam. So you are going to find when you dig into it that you can interpret it different ways. You can argue over hadith. You can argue over Quran. Even the Quranic variants, for God's sakes. Even the Quran itself, right? So everything about Islam has been a human effort. Everything about any religion, actually. But in particular, we're talking about Islam. So keep in mind, there is no one true Islam. There's no one fundamental Islam. Muslims that don't believe in ISIS are not being bad Muslims. You can't say that they're bad Muslims. You can't say that moderate Muslims, the ones that don't want to do jihad and don't believe in Sharia law, if that's how you define moderate Muslims, you can't say they're not proper Muslims. Because there are Muslim scholars like Hamza Yusuf who are against the idea of bringing hudud, capital punishment, back in Islam.
The whole concept of an Islamic state is a fantasy in the minds of a lot of the modern Islamists. But if you actually study Muslim history, that you will find, yes, Islam was the state religion, but the states functioned just like a secular state functions, because religion actually has very little to do with the running of a state.
He says we don't need that. That was there for its own purpose back then, to protect the religion, to promote the maqasid, the goals of the sharia. We don't need that anymore. Of course, the Islamists, people like Hizb ut-Tahrir, Muslim Brotherhood, and Jamia Islamiyah, the Islamic movements, they will argue that Islamic law is the most important thing. Sharia law, right? Chopping off the hands, whatever. But the other Muslims will say, no, that's not important anymore, and the important thing is to worship Allah. And these things actually take people away from Islam, so we don't need them anymore. So there's always going to be a conflict. As an ex-Muslim, as an atheist, I have to acknowledge that there are multiple versions of Islam. Each of them has its arguments or its reason to believe or not to believe. At the end of the day, it's all man-made nonsense. So that is where I will leave it. If God was true, he shouldn't have left this religion in such a mess. He shouldn't have left it in such a situation that when Muhammad died, there was huge apostasy. There was the war. There had to be a war, the Ridda wars, right, to bring people back to Islam, because they didn't want to pay the zakat and they didn't want to, listen to Abu Bakr. The Quran wasn't even preserved as a book. It wasn't compiled as a book, I should say. There was so many issues. Who was going to be the next leader after Muhammad? Nothing was settled. So if Islam is true, Allah's a really bad planner. Muhammad, of course, was just a man, which is why he ended up with all these contradictions and problems and issues, which is why I left Islam. I don't believe in it. But we should expect better from Allah. We should expect better from the creator of the universe than to leave a religion with so much violence, hatred, and such a misogyny and such a mess. So that's all I have. I'm your friendly ex-Muslim, Abdullah Samir. Thanks for watching. Thank you to my patrons for continuing to support the channel. I really appreciate every one of you. And for channel members who have joined, you can join if you haven't joined. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel, please do consider doing so. The link to my Patreon is below. Thank you for watching. This is your friendly ex-Muslim signing out.